Good evening, friends. Welcome. As you know, we have begun this wonderful series now a few months that Nader Saiedi has been speaking with us every other Monday night. I'm so used to it now, I can't bear the thought of reaching its conclusion. Tonight is not the last lecture, but we are getting close to it. And we like to start promptly at 7:30, which is the time that we've told everybody to be here. We know it takes time to park. Parking is miserable around the center. Hopefully none of you have parked your car in a place it shouldn't be, because Santa Monica parking tickets are extremely expensive. I think most of you have been here in previous lectures. However, you know that we keep a list of names, emails, and phone numbers of each of you in order to notify you if there should be a change in the program schedule. So I have a list that is a sign-up list if any of you are coming for the first time, or if on previous occasions you forgot to sign your name. Please do so tonight. I'm going to put it on the stage here, and when we are finished with the questions and answers part after the lecture, before you go to the multipurpose room, please do sign. Thank you very much. Would you come to the stage?
I decided that today would be the last session that I talk about the writings of Baha'u'llah. That means that from next session, we would have, after these 3 more sessions, I would concentrate on the writings of Abdul Baha. It also means that today I have to talk about all of them very important topics, because within one session, I'm going to focus on many aspects of the writings of Baha'u'llah that we did not touch in any way. So I decided to have 2 general topics. One is to have some discussion of Kitab Aqdas, the most holy book of Baha'u'llah. It really would not make sense to have a discussion of the writings of Baha'u'llah without some reference to this central book. But in addition to that, I'm going to talk about the latest writings of Baha'u'llah, namely writings of Baha'u'llah in 1891, 1892. And I'm going to emphasize 3 particular texts which are written during these times, the last year of the life of Baha'u'llah, 1891, 1892. And these 3 texts are Lawh Dunya, tablet of Dunya, tablet of the world, his Book of Covenant, Kitab Ahd, and his work, Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, Risaleh Ibn Zayd. So what I want to talk about these 3 texts, not the details of these 3 texts, to look at the historical context of this particular time period and the relevance of that context to these particular 3 texts, and explore one aspect of that. And I don't know with which one I should begin. I'm afraid if I begin with one, maybe I talk so much that the second one would be lost. So. Well, that means to have the discussion in the next Monday, 2 Mondays from now, but really we have to deal some basic things about the writings of Abdul Baha as well. So let me begin with the second one, so that I'll say something very briefly about it, and then I'll come back and concentrate more on the Kitab Aqdas. With regard to these 3 particular texts, which are samples of the writings of Baha'u'llah close to the end of his life, what is important to know, among other things, is that all these texts, to some extent, are related to, and many of the texts of Baha'u'llah, to the events which were going on in Iran at the level of the society and politics in Iran. In general, Baha'u'llah has to be seen as a reformer of the world, reformer of Iran, and reformer of religion. Everything that Baha'u'llah does is related to these three elements. He deals with many societies, but usually in generalities. But with regard to Iran, it is an exception. The writings of Baha'u'llah, writings of Abdul Baha, they concentrate and focus on Iran in particular, and a lot of these texts deal with very specific questions in terms of development of Iran and social, cultural, political issues in Iran. A number of these issues I would focus when I talk about Abdul Baha. But the last text of Baha'u'llah, in this case, the Book of Covenant, Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, and the Tablet of the Word, they all have this particular context. Namely, first I mentioned the context and then the relevance of that context in an expression of that context in these three texts. 1891, and then extending into 1892 in Iranian history is a turning point. This is the moment that the clergy, the ulama in Iran, as a group, discovers its political power, discovers that it can mobilize the masses for collective political action and for protest movement and so on. It discovers its power, really. This is the first time that it's happening in this fashion. What happened was that as part of the general structure of the Qajar period, one of the strategies in the court for financing some sort of money for particular purposes, some of them a little bit for modernizing the state, many of them for varieties of waste, for expenditures of the Shah and the rest. One of the strategies was to give concessions to foreigners. And were made, usually there were opposition to that, circles in Iran, including the clergy, who wanted to have nothing to do with the West, and not only they were opposed to the fact of concessions, giving concessions to the West, but also they thought that this would open the Westerners to Iran, and they didn't want. Also, this might have helped for some sort of modernization and change, which they were adamantly opposed to that. But in any case, previous concessions were opposed, but not so vehemently. In 1891, there is opposition to a particular concession which is made, and this particular opposition becomes a very powerful force. This is the so-called tobacco concession and the resulting tobacco revolt. In Persian, they say واقعه رژی many times. What happened was that the king of Iran, Nasruddin Shah, gives a concession for tobacco to a British company. And the tobacco was different from the previous concessions. Previous concessions, for instance, was for construction of railroad, for example. And the railroad was something, of course, that Iranians didn't have it, they couldn't make it, they didn't have the technical means and so on. So it was a little bit less objectionable. It was something that the foreigners would come and do. Tobacco, however, dealt with something which was essential aspect of the agriculture and economy of Iran. Merchants, peasants, their interests were directly involved, and so giving complete concession of control for selling and and marketing everything related to tobacco by this British company united the opposition of merchants, the clergy, the peasants, and many other groups in Iran. The result of this was that a number of more reformist people in the clerical ranks, some of them actually didn't believe in Islam or religion, but they pretended that they are devout Muslims, like Jamaluddin Asadabadi, who is known more as Al-Afghani, that most likely he wasn't much religious, but when necessary he pretended that he's such a devout Muslim, and he's one of the heroes of the Islamic groups and so on. In any case, people like him, they try to oppose to mobilize and organize the society against this concession, and what happened, they wanted the supreme source of emulation, the highest clerical authority, Shia authority in the world, to interfere and issue a decree according to which it forbids the use of tobacco in any form. Now, this supreme cleric, his name was Hassan Shirazi, Mirza Hassan Shirazi. And he writes this decree. Some people say that it is really not originally written by him, but later on he didn't denounce it, nor rejected it, and approved its presence. So in any case, he wrote something, and according to that decree, for all Shia Muslims, use of tobacco became prohibited. This happened in 1891, and the consequence of this was that all over Iran, everywhere, everybody stopped smoking, everybody stopped using tobacco in any fashion. Even in the household of the Shah, in the household of the king, Nasruddin Shah, his various wives and the like, they refused to bring him tobacco. I mean, that was the power of this, clergy. It created a situation that, and this united opposition and absolute prohibition of this tobacco, to a point that in a few months, Nasruddin Shah was forced to give in and cancel that concession, which Iran then had to pay lots of fines for it and so on. But this event, 1891, 1892, this tobacco revolt, was the moment that the clergy in Iran, Shia clergy in Iran, became conscious of its political power, of its independence versus a state, and the fact that it can control a state, manipulate a state, oppose a state if necessary, and the fact that for political action it can mobilize the masses. This is the turning point. And whatever happened in Iran during the 20th century really to a large extent begin at this very moment. And through varieties of reasons, which unfortunately this is not the place to discuss this, in most periods of 20th century, in varieties of fashions, critique of dictatorship, political dictatorship of the king, for example, was interpreted by the people in Iran, including by intellectuals during 1960s and 1970s in particular, was interpreted as legitimization of the religious despotism, of the authority of the clerics, and the idea that they are progressive ones. So they became the symbols increasingly of opposition to political dictatorship, and therefore it paved the way ultimately for a situation that opposition to the dictatorship turned into creation of a not only religious but also political despotism. Its name was Islamic Revolution, and it continues up to this point. But the source of this goes back to this moment. And it is at this moment that the idea that church and state should not be separate. On the contrary, that the clerics should have the leadership in political action and in control of Iran, and ultimately to be the rulers of Iran and so on. It begins with this particular time period and this particular event. It's a very important formative event in the history of Iran. The interesting point is that while everybody in Iran, all intellectuals, even those who were apparently a little bit secular, they were celebrating these events, and they were celebrating the clergy as these very progressive ones, and therefore celebrating and praising the interference and intervention of the clerics in the realm of state and politics, and would see not only no problem with this intervention, but also would find it so progressive and so on. In the middle of this situation, which continued for a long time, and then after the Islamic Revolution, Iranians have started to change their mind about this, and now they have a different view about it. But in the middle of this, it is very, very strange that both Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha write directly at this very same time, sometimes directly and explicitly addressing the issue, sometimes not explicitly addressing it, but indirectly addressing it. And in all cases, what is emphasized by Baha'u'llah and by Abdul Baha is the exact opposite point, namely warning to Iranians that church and state must be separate, and that the intervention of the ulama, of the clerical caste in politics would lead to new forms of despotism and destruction of freedom, liberty in Iran. Abdul Baha, when he assumes the leadership of the Baha'i faith, the first thing that he does, he writes that famous work, the Treatise on Politics, Risale Siyasiyeh, in which he directly addresses this question and insists that church and state must be separate from each other. I'll deal with this particular work of Abdul Baha next session. But it is interesting that Baha'u'llah also, almost anything that he's writing during this time, in some ways he's addressing the same issue. Because I want to be very brief about it and so have time to go to Kitab Aqdas, I'll be extremely concise. Kitab Ahd, the Book of Covenant of Baha'u'llah, begins with emphasizing this fact that he came to the world for the sake of uniting the hearts of the people. You remember that. I don't need to read it for you. That his purpose of coming to the world, writing works, creating a new civilization, and so on, all was emergence of unity and love in the world. Rejection of violence. Now, in order to safeguard this non-violent principle of unity, that text emphasizes two very important principles. One, of course, is the principle of succession. Namely, he emphasizes for the sake of love and unity, it is important that Baha'i faith itself does not become a source of dissension and conflict and hatred and war. And so for that reason, he makes sure that there is a covenant in a particular fashion, that the leadership of the Baha'i faith is not something arbitrary. The leadership is explicitly defined by that text, and the question of succession, therefore, is resolved. which is a very important aspect of the same principle that, as he says in the Book of Covenant, that do not make the religion of God itself a cause of conflict and hatred. One of the very important ways that he does this, guarantee this, is that principle of covenant and appointment of Abdul Baha as his successor. The second principle that he emphasizes is the principle of separation of church and state. Immediately after discussing that, Baha'u'llah emphasizes that kings and rulers and so on, God has given dominion of earth to these people, and God has reserved for himself the dominion over the heart of the people, and that these two are separate. And he emphasizes that this is a principle that would never be revoked, that it is preserved and protected from annulment. Namely, he discusses this as a fundamental, essential principle of the Baha'i faith. And now why this is the case? Because historically speaking, whenever the clergy has interfered in the realm of politics, whenever the apparatus, repressive apparatus of state and its power of coercion has become not a means of safeguarding freedom of the people, including religious freedom of the people, but on the contrary, becoming an instrument for promoting a particular religion and oppressing and discriminating against other religions, this has always been the major way, the major means of destroying religion, of destroying freedom of the citizens, and of course creation of violence and hatred in the world. The best example of that is present Iran, that you see that religion, instead of becoming a force for bringing people together, becomes constantly a force of violence. So this principle that Baha'u'llah is emphasizing is directly written and in relation to the tobacco revolt. It's talking about the authority of the clergy and the event that happened, that the society, intellectuals of Iran and so on started to celebrate it as welcoming the intervention and control of state by the clerics at this time. Epistle to the Son of the Wolf is a very important text in which Baha'u'llah, in a sense, gives a general sense of all his revelation. But one of the most important principles, which is repeated a number of times in this text, very explicitly, and not just as one statement, the pages are devoted to that, is the question of separation of church and state. And Baha'u'llah quotes from the gospel, that render to Caesar what is due to Caesar, render to God whatever is due to God, and so on, and refers to Islamic traditions and interprets them in ways which are contrary to the notion of unity of church and state. He is very clear about that and very emphatic. This is written again in the context of the unity of church and state. The addressee, of course, is one of these very brutal, famous, powerful clerics in Iran, in Isfahan, who had a sort of semi-state for himself. As a matter of fact, Qajar state at this time is a patrimonial state, namely there is a Shah who apparently has all the power, absolute power, his whim is the rule. But in reality that Shah didn't have much power, because power was decentralized and all different groups of people, tribal groups, nomadic groups, religious groups, big landlords and so on, they had their own political military power. And the king was completely dependent on these people. The idea of a standing army, national centralized army, and these things come into existence in 20th century after Pahlavi dynasty. It did not exist in the Qajar period. So this Isfahani cleric, who is the addressee of the Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, is one of these people who is extremely rich and extremely powerful and has his own army and uses that through his own whims for varieties of corrupt means, and is very famous in terms of corruption and so on. So Baha'u'llah, writing to this particular person, is at the same time addressing the existential political reality of that this person represented. And of course is at the time of the tobacco revolt, and Baha'u'llah's emphasis on the fact that the ulama should be concerned and their duty is the hearts of the people, not the realm of dominion over earth. And the other text of Baha'u'llah, Tablet of the World. Tablet of the World, Baha'u'llah makes sure that he talks about Iran and the plan for reform of Iran in this particular text in a number of ways. The idea of political democracy that he has discussed long time ago in 1860s in different tablets of Baha'u'llah is repeated here, and he recommends political democracy and some sort of constitutional democracy in Iran, in which king is there but has only a ceremonial rule, but the actual political decision making is due to democratic process. But one of the very important statements that Baha'u'llah makes regarding the reform of Iran is this particular statement. He discusses 5 measures for improvement, but the 5th one, he says, is the most important one. He talks of it as the 5th one, but he considers it as the most important one. So let me see if I can if I can find it and read it for you. Yes, he says, special regard must be paid to agriculture. Tobacco is the realm of agriculture. Special regard must be paid to agriculture. Although it has been mentioned in the 5th place within the 5 measures that Baha'u'llah is discussing, unquestionably it precedes the others. Agriculture is highly developed in foreign lands. However, in Persia, it has so far been grievously neglected. And then he encourages the king of Iran, Nasruddin Shah, to pay particular attention for this and engage in this particular form of reform. This is directly the question of land reform and agricultural reform that Baha'u'llah is emphasizing as part of his notion of development of Iran, which happens to be the number one, perhaps, economic obstacle and problem in 20th century Iran. Namely, despite everything that was tried, agriculture and the agrarian sector was kept neglected in varieties of ways by Reza Shah, later on by Muhammad Reza Shah, and it had, of course, devastating consequences for economy, political events, and cultural events as well. The discussion of agriculture and the necessity of reform of agriculture here is directly addressing the question of tobacco concession. And Baha'u'llah here, as one Cole once wrote in a work, and I think he was the first one who noted this connection, this is directly criticism and rejection of that concession. Baha'u'llah is criticizing the tobacco concession, namely that this is not the way to reform the agriculture. It is a way of destroying agriculture by selling out the control of that to the outsiders. But the statement of Baha'u'llah at the same time has so many important principles and hints, what I read for you, within that it's important to be analyzed a little bit. You have to remember, of course, that the supreme cleric who gave that decree for tobacco revolt was the cousin of the Bab. Mirza Hassan Shirazi, he's the cousin of the Bab, and he's secretly a Baha'i. definitely a Babi, but according to Afnan's relatives of him and relatives of the Bab and so on, he was actually a secret Baha'i. So this whole turning point of events was actually initiated, and this makes sense because in the Babi faith, in the writings of the Bab, tobacco is absolutely prohibited forever. It's not a temporary thing. It's categorically prohibited, tobacco. It was a sign of being a Babi, that no tobacco, categorically no tobacco. In any case, but let's look at what Baha'u'llah is saying here. He's criticizing the concession, but in the political context and cultural context of tobacco revolt, this was understood, first of all, as denunciation of the West. Namely, these Westerns are infidels and bad, and we should have no connection with them, and we should become more Islamicized and go back to our past. Baha'u'llah is criticizing the concession, but at the same time, he's pointing to a positive point about the Western societies. Namely, he's saying that in the West, there has been reform of agriculture, has been a priority, and there has been achievements in the West. So he's saying that concession is bad, but there are aspects of these Western societies which are compatible with reason, with social justice development, and that Iranians have to learn that. This is very important. When you read the history of 20th century Iran, when the people, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, intellectuals talk about the West, West becomes just one thing, one abstraction, which is all evil, all bad, everything. The degree of really childishness of the discourse, dominant discourse in intellectual discourse of Iranians, whether they are Marxists, they are religious, doesn't matter, all of them, about West is just unbelievable. And of course, because West becomes all evil, then we have to go back to what is the opposite of that, which becomes our own tradition. Iranians have to go back to their own tradition, which becomes the absolute good. And what is that own tradition ultimately becomes what clerics represent. And that meant that we had a very different political, cultural discourse in Iran, which ultimately led to the form of revolution that happened in Iran. Baha'u'llah, on the contrary, here he is praising the West. At the same time that he is criticizing the notion of concession, he's not defining the West as this evil thing, that it has lots of positive things, and should not be forgotten. There is one other thing very, very powerful here. He is criticizing the concessions and emphasizing the necessity of autonomy of Iran, rejection of colonialism and imperialism. But he is arguing that rejection of this concession means that something we should do, and that something that we should do is agricultural reform, land reform, and the like. And this is very, very important. This is what he is emphasizing, because the clerical groups who were rejecting the concession, their main obsession, political obsession in Iran, was always rejection of land reform. Land reform was something that unanimously the clerics defined it as un-Islamic and contrary to Islamic law. It is difficult for people to realize this because it has been the characteristics of the clerical caste in Iran that at first, for everything new, they would first oppose it. And after some time goes on and it becomes part of the normal life of the society and so on, they give in and they talk as if they have been progressive all the time and no problem. Every single aspect of the life, whether to have a modern school or not, whether girls can go to a school or not, whether you can have vaccination or not, whether you can have modern medicine and anatomy or not, whether you can have a democracy in any form or shape or not. I mean, anything that you can imagine, and including, of course, always consistently land reform. These were consistently opposed by the ulama. Always it was opposing the cause of progress, but then gradually they would give in. So you will see in Iran that now the clergy don't say that women should not go to school. They won't say that, or there should be no modern school. No longer they would say that. But of course, there are two things that they never compromised about it. One is opposition to the Baha'is, and one is a general aversion to freedom of women. These two issues they always had particular obsession with, and defined to a large extent their identity. The supreme religious cleric, for example, his name is Borujerdi, Ayatollah Borujerdi, who was the greatest source of emulation in Iran between 1947 and 1961. 61 he died. He was among these others who issued this formal decree that any form of land reform in Iran is un-Islamic, because Islam, according to his decree, prohibits putting any limitation on the amount of property that one can have. So I want you to understand that this statement of Baha'u'llah, although at first it appeared to be something very ordinary, it is dealing with a lot of complex socio-political issues in the context of Iran, opposing the concessions, but at the same time praising a very important aspect of Western experience, which was agrarian reform in the West comes before industrialization and supports industrialization. In Iran, this never happened, and therefore industrialization comes and takes place in some distorted ways, but without agrarian reform and the contradictions that it always created, among other things. But the other thing is that Baha'u'llah takes the question of the concession, 1892 tobacco problem, and turns that into the exact opposite of the ideology of the clerics, namely insistence on the necessity of social justice, necessity of agricultural reform, land reform in Iran, which was the exact opposite of the clerical positions and the like. I just wanted to mention the relevance of this historical context to this text and so on in some ways. Now I discuss, let me see what time it is. I discuss in the remainder of my time, perhaps for 20 minutes, some basic things about Kitab Aqdas. Kitab Aqdas for Baha'u'llah ultimately is not a set of regulations and laws. He was actually very reluctant to reveal any particular set of laws. He says that in Kitab Aqdas very clearly. And unfortunately, the Baha'is of the time, to a large extent, had the same mentality of the Shia dependence on the clerics, that for every detailed aspect of the life, they wanted these clerics to give them instruction that what is the will of God for doing this, doing that, and so on, which was the strategy of the clerics at that time. It's called the Usuli School of Jurisprudence in Islamic law in 19th century Iran, which had its very important principle that every detailed aspect of the life should be regulated by the divine will. And nobody knows the divine will except the clerics. So everybody should imitate and follow the clerics for every detailed aspect of the life. And it was through this that they penetrated the culture, and Islam became not just an abstract idea of the elites in the cities and so on, but it penetrated the masses of the people. during the 20th century. And this Islamization and control of the people by the clerics and their increasing power partly was rooted in this very important process. So Baha'is also were part of this culture. They were coming from this culture and so on. So when Baha'u'llah came also, they constantly would write to Baha'u'llah and ask for laws, for specific regulations of this aspect of life and that aspect of life. And Baha'u'llah says that we didn't move the pen. We prevented the pen from moving. And he says, but then they wrote, and there was this pile up and pile up and pile up of these letters and so. Then he says that, therefore Baha'u'llah gave up and wrote laws. However, even though he revealed some laws, he is emphasizing, both in Kitab Aqdas and in other places, that the most important aspect and the purpose is the mystical meaning and philosophy of these laws, of these principles. And it's not the specific, this law or that law as a symbolic entity. This is exactly the way that the Bab wrote Persian Bayan or Arabic Bayan, which is a book of laws. But he constantly says that none of these laws by themselves are the purpose. He says that they are expressions and symbols of mystical meanings. And he says that you have to pay attention to those mystical meanings. All the time, he says, he's very explicit about it. Kitab Aqdas is exactly the same. It is these spiritual principles, these mystical principles, which become expressed in these symbolic fashions of various laws and so on, but always, which happens to be in Kitab Aqdas, generalities. He never went into very detailed laws, and so his laws remain very abstract and general. But even then, the purpose is primarily the spiritual mystical principles behind them. But what I want to say today is a little bit about the beginning of Kitab Aqdas and the end of Kitab Aqdas. And now I want to, if you allow me to give myself a lot of freedom for this discussion that I want to have, to share with you some of my own understandings of what is happening. I'm going to now become a student of philosophy, which always from my childhood I loved philosophy. And so to take that role and that position and look at the beginning of Kitab Aqdas and the end of Kitab Aqdas and the relation of this. Kitab Aqdas has a particular order. It has a beginning and an end which are completely related to each other. And in between are particular principles and laws and institutions that he discusses, but they are mediations for connecting the beginning to the end. So this beginning and end become the philosophical principles that I want to connect it to each other now. So things that I say to a large extent are my reflections. It does not have to be necessarily all accurate, anything that I share. It's my personal reflections on this with you from a philosophical point of view, all right? I'm going to read from the English translation, but I would go back also to the original for some of these discussions. The Kitab Aqdas begins, the first paragraph of Kitab Aqdas begins with the first duty prescribed by God for his servants is the recognition of him who is the day spring of his revelation and the fountain of his laws. Let's now concentrate just on this statement. The first thing that I want you to pay attention is this word first. Allah says the first duty prescribed by God. In its original Arabic, the literal way of translating this is that the first thing, not the first duty, the first thing which God wrote for his servants is recognition and so on. What is translated here, the first duty prescribed by God for his servants, in the more literal translation of this is إِنَّ أَوَّلَ مَا كَتَبَ اللَّهُ عَلَى الْعِبَادِ. The first thing that God wrote for people, for his servants, for the servants, is the recognition. Of course, the meaning is exactly the translation in English. The first duty prescribed by God for his servants is the recognition of him who is the dayspring of his revelation. You should pay attention to this first and what this firstness means. It is crucial, this word first here. But in order to understand that, let's discuss other parts a little bit, and then I come back to the firstness of this first. You see here that the word God is mentioned. It begins with God. God is discussed as a supreme beginning. But then this God, the first duty that it ordains for servants is recognition of the manifestation of God. The first duty that God, not manifestation of God, God prescribes for servants is recognition of the spring of his revelation, things like that, namely manifestation of God. Now, this is, everything in Kitab al-Aqdas beginning and end is so dialectical. So, first, God is defined as this reality which is transcendental. We cannot know God, we cannot understand God. Therefore, what God prescribes is recognition of the expression of God in this world, manifestation of God, not God, because God we cannot know. So at first, God is defined as this reality which is absolutely transcendental. We cannot know, we cannot understand, and therefore recognition goes to not God, but the revelation of God, but the expression of God, symbol of God, manifestation of God in this world. But immediately this dialectic begins, because the first thing that God prescribes, or literally the first thing that God writes, God writes. But writing is a characteristic of not transcendental God. Writing is a characteristic of a spirit, characteristics of consciousness. Baha'u'llah is emphasizing writing. Writing is very important because writing, the act of writing, symbolizes consciousness, a spirit in absolute fashion, because it is symbol of the symbol. Writing is symbol of words that you speak, right? And consciousness, spirit, is a realm of creation of symbols. But the act of writing is symbol of the symbol. So every element of materiality, naturalness is dissolved, and you are in the realm of spirit as a spirit. But of course, writing is something that humans do. It's a human characteristics. We as consciousness, as a spirit, we human beings do writing, which now God, the transcendental God, first we begin with transcendental God, but immediately this transcendental God writes. And writes for, as a duty, expression of a duty through this act of writing for people, writes for whom? The first duty prescribed or written by God for servants. Now human beings are mentioned, but human beings are mentioned as servants. At this time it appears there is a dichotomy between God and human being. God is the absolute, human beings are just servants. They have servitude. There is this binary opposition which is emphasized. And yet, What is that God has written for servants? The first thing that he has written for servants, it is recognition. It is irfan, recognition of the manifestation. But recognition is the activity and the truth of a spirit, of consciousness. God is, in the beginning, God is defined as spirit, as consciousness, as the one who writes, prescribes, writes. Now the servants, which in the beginning appear to be different and opposed to God, God absolute, servants, humans, nothing. Now they also appear as spirit. What God wants of human beings, of ibad, of servants, is recognition. That they have to recognize the manifestation of God. So in this dialectical process, what you see, what is happening is human being is identified at first as just a creature who has nothing to do with God, is in absolute state of servitude to God, a God who is transcendental. At the same time, when you read the statement, it becomes the exact opposite. God and human being becomes partners with each other. Human being becomes a spiritual reality. Human beings appear as a spirit, as consciousness. Pay attention to the fact that Baha'u'llah doesn't say that the first duty prescribed by God to his servants is recognition. He doesn't say to some of his servants. He doesn't say to the clerics. He doesn't say to the scholars. He doesn't say to the literate. He doesn't say to scientists. He says the first duty written, prescribed by God for servants, namely all human beings. All human beings are defined as capable of recognition, as people who have the duty to recognize their essence, their identity, their truth, their life. And this is the firstness of the first, is defined in terms of recognition. And recognition is an internal process, is an act of consciousness, is not an imitation by somebody else. You do not engage in irfan, in recognition by imitation of others. It is something that you do, it's an internal process of consciousness. So in the very first page of, in the very first statement of the Aqdas, that I'm not finished with the first statement of Aqdas, you see in a dialectical process that at first they appear to be, at first you have the contradiction between transcendental God and a God who becomes revealed in the world, that has manifestation in the world. And then you have the contradiction between, opposition between human beings as servants in front of this God, that God is writing a duty for them. And at the same time, this duty becomes the same thing that God did. God writes, and the human beings have to recognize. Both become one and the same. Both become partners in the same reality. What is being emphasized, and then of course, what is the object of this recognition? The object of this recognition becomes manifestation of God. What is the manifestation of God? Becomes the synthesis of God as this transcendental reality and human being as servitude. You remember in my first discussion of the writings of the Bab discussed the station of the point as the unity of divinity and servitude. That is the reflection of God in this world. It is part of this world. It's part of the servants, the manifestation of God is a servant. Yet it is a servant as a pure mirror in which nothing can be seen except the revelation of God. It becomes a synthesis of the two. The two become one and the same in this manifestation of God. But this manifestation of God already is the truth and reality of you and me. These ibad, these servants, were defined as spirit, all of them equal, all of them sacred, and all of them defined in terms of their existential character, the capacity and the duty to know independently, to think for themselves, and to have ideas and approach to truth. So what is this firstness now? I want to emphasize this firstness a little bit. I'm not going to continue the rest of statement. Everything is dialectical in discussion of Baha'u'llah here. Immediately after that, what he says? He says, whoso achieves this duty, if you achieve recognition, has attained unto all good. It's very strange. If you have achieved recognition, you have achieved all good. All good is a Platonic term. Namely, all things which are considered to be good, the essence of reality and truth, which becomes justice, for example, love, all these things, including things that we call moral good. All good, kull khair. All these things you have achieved it if you have achieved recognition. And yet, immediately after that, in the next statement, it says the person who is deprived is straight even if he appears with all deeds. So in the second one appears that they are different. You can have recognition but not deeds. But in the first one, it was the exact opposite. If you have attained recognition, you already have achieved all good. It's impossible to have true irfan and recognition and not to be a moral entity, not to do moral act. How these two are going to be recognized, this dialectical, requires discussion, which I don't think I would have any time for doing that. But I'm saying that everything in this paragraph has these double structures, and you just can't read it as a simple literal text and go. But what is this firstness? You remember the first duty prescribed by God for his servants is the recognition, becomes recognition of the manifestation of God. Remember the first hidden words, which I talked about it, maybe, I don't remember, in these discussions. Allah said also, my first counsel to you is this: possess a pure, radiant, kindly, radiant heart. And if you do that, the result is that you would possess the sovereignty which is eternal. Namely, if you purify your heart, your being becomes this pure mirror in which nothing can be seen except divine attributes. You become a reflection of God. And therefore, God and sovereignty of God becomes your characteristics by this act of purification. That one is a methodological discussion. It is the first counsel of Baha'u'llah, because before discussing anything else or knowing anything else, you have to first understand the method of approaching truth. The question of method becomes relevant. And in Kitab Aqdas, that same principle is becoming discussed by this form. The first duty prescribed by God to servants becomes recognition of the manifestation of God. Again, is a question of understanding the truth, is recognition of the truth. However, in this case, this firstness has more meanings than what is discussed in the beginning of the hidden words. This firstness, among other things, is the metaphysical firstness of being, namely before knowing any particular truth about physical, chemical aspects of this thing or that thing and so on, I have to be concerned with the ultimate truth of my own being and ultimate truth of all reality. And that is the question of recognition, of irfan, of recognition of God and revelation of God in the world, looking at myself and at the world as the truth of this thing, which becomes a spiritual reality, becomes a reflection of the divine, becomes a reflection of God. Such knowledge, such truth for Baha'u'llah becomes the primordial truth, preceding every other specific truth, which in the form of material or scientific or other form of discourse or truth and so on become relevant. This form of knowledge, self-knowledge, understanding our own truth, which is the same as understanding the truth of all beings, which is the same as understanding God and revelation of God in the world. This has a firstness as metaphysics of being. The last thing that I want to say about this firstness, which is the most difficult, is Baha'u'llah is discussing here the firstness as metaphysics of truth. Before knowing any truth, truth becomes, in the history of philosophy, the question of relation between subject and object, thought and reality. And the point is that they would correspond with each other. We call something true if mind and reality, thought and objective reality, they correspond with each other and become one and the same, right? You have an idea. You call it true if it corresponds to the reality out there. If it doesn't, they are not harmonious with each other, they don't correspond to each other, it's not truth, it's falsehood and so on. But how this truth is possible? How we know that experiences, conceptions that we have in the form of thoughts, ideas and so on about the world really corresponds to the reality of the world? We cannot get out of our consciousness. You know, you have a picture of me right now. Is your picture true or not? So you think that it is true if you come close and look at me. But if you come very close to look at me, what do you see? Is another idea. You are comparing your previous idea with a new idea. You never can get out of your mind. You can never get out of your experience to see me directly, right? So always there is this question, how I can be sure that I have access to any truth, that there is any correspondence between thought and reality. This has always been a philosophical problem in the history of philosophy. Descartes, who to a large extent began the modern philosophy, started to solve this question after he came up with this idea that I can doubt about everything except the fact that I'm doubting and therefore I'm thinking. After this, he came up to the idea that God exists. Forget about his arguments for proving the existence of God, but that was the first thing that he proved for himself, and now he was sure that there is a God. And then he said, now that I know that there is a God, therefore now I am confident that my ideas of reality are not deceptions. A sense of confidence came to him, that therefore mind and its understanding about the world corresponds with the world because there is a God. In other words, God became, in the philosophy of Descartes, the precondition for every truth. In a more sophisticated fashion, God becomes the precondition of any truth because God becomes, by definition, the absolute unity of thought and reality. God becomes defined as a particular essence, a definition, for instance, absolute perfection. But then that absolute perfection, as Anselm and Descartes and lots of others have said, requires existence, because existence itself is a perfection. So the idea of God requires the existence of God. So in the very notion of God, this infinite, philosophically, thought and reality become one and the same. Absolutely, subjectivity and objectivity, thought and reality become one and the same. And because of that absolute unity of the two, this becomes the precondition of existence of any form of truth whatsoever. So Baha'u'llah begins with the firstness of recognition of God in the form of revelation of God in this world. But it's so interesting that this becomes the basis of the end of Kitab Aqdas. What is the end of Kitab Aqdas? The end of Kitab Aqdas is discussion of the fact that this human being, which was defined in the beginning of Kitab Aqdas, who was just a servant first, but this servant suddenly became characterized by partner with God, by a reflection of God, a manifestation of God, that attributes of God is present as a spirit, as consciousness. Humans emerge now as a spirit, as consciousness, as sacred. In the beginning of Aqdas, this is an abstract and mystical principle, as an individual reality of me and you. But then the process of Aqdas becomes a process that this spirit wants to realize, externalize, objectify its own spiritual truth in the world, creates a world, a new world, with new institutions, with new culture, which becomes expression of this spiritual reality of human being, which becomes a reflection of the kingdom of God. This is the culture of oneness of humanity. This is the culture of peace. And this is the age of maturation of humanity, when collectively humanity emerges as spirit, as reason, as consciousness. So, Baha'u'llah ends Kitab Aqdas, and I read it for you. All members of parliaments throughout the world select ye a single language for the use of all on earth, and adopt ye likewise a common script. God verily makes plain for you that which shall profit you and enable you to be independent of others. He of truth is the most bountiful, the all-knowing, the all-informed. This will be unity of language. This will be the cause of unity, could ye but comprehend it. And the greatest instrument for promoting harmony and civilization, would that ye might understand. We have appointed 2 signs for the coming of age of the human race. The first, which is the most firm foundation, we have set down in other of our tablets, while the second has been revealed in this wondrous book, namely the principle of one auxiliary language, unity of language that Baha'u'llah is talking about. Again, language, which becomes a realm of a spirit, becomes a realm of consciousness, the realm of symbolism, through which spirit is recognizing itself, objectifying itself, expressing itself in the world. Words are something material, but the essence of that is a spirit, is meaning. Spirit is making itself objective. Thought is making itself objective. So Baha'u'llah is ending Kitab Aqdas with discussion of creation of a new order, new society, new set of civilization, new social institution. But this new spiritual culture, this civilization becomes expression of the principle of a spirit, becomes expression of the truth of this human being as a spirit, which is discussed in the beginning of Aqdas. That human spirit now creates a world. And through creation of this new civilization becomes simultaneously the unity of objectivity and subjectivity. Now that reality itself is created by a spirit, it's not something out there, it's created by it. And it is expression of that spirit, of that thought, of that principle, of a spirit. So the question of truth becomes resolved now in a completely different fashion. At the end of Kitab Aqdas, it's not just God as a guarantee, as a precondition for reality of everything and the truth, and a sense of confidence in the world that truth is possible. It becomes more than that. We now, as a spirit and spiritual beings, we create a new world. Our society, our culture now becomes expressions of spiritual intentions, of that inner spirit. And therefore, in this reality although it is something objective, but it is nothing but the spirit itself. Spirit which has been externalized. Spirit which has expressed itself in this way. And this is the order of Kitab Aqdas. Kitab Aqdas, which I had to be, chopped down and cut this thing, and so just say a few words about it here and so on. Kitab Aqdas begins with affirmation of something which is first, is firstness, spiritual interpretation of reality, spiritual truth of all beings, and of the rise of human being as something, as a reality which is spiritual, whose truth is understood in terms of irfan, recognition of God, but through manifestation of God in this world, which the truth of this reality, of this seven, is also that same reality. And then, after Baha'u'llah discusses this metaphysics of the reality, this mystical reality of beings and individuals and so on, then he discusses institutions and principles centered on the concept of nonviolence and equality. And through these things, they become mediators of creation of a new society. And that new civilization that these spirits as spirits are going to create become realization at the social and collective level of that same spiritual principle. Whenever Baha'u'llah talked about coming of age of humanity or maturation of humanity, he says that that is the age of appearance of aql among the people. And this aql, this reason, this intellect for Baha'u'llah is both instrumental intellect and moral intellect. And guardian for that reason translated as wisdom, is a time of the advent of wisdom among the people, not for this individual or that individual, but collectively. This is the moment that we emerge as human beings, not as natural things. That is the moment of maturation, appearance of reason, appearance of spirit, appearance of us collectively. And this is a principle of unity and non-violence, which he talks about when he talks about signs of maturation of humanity. For instance, a very important sign is that kingship is there, left, but nobody would have any desire to approach it. The thirst for domination goes away. The desire for unity, for service, that detachment that Baha'u'llah talked about in so many ways and so on, so emerges. It's the principle of a non-violent new civilization which becomes expression of the kingdom of God. That a spiritual principle now is creating a world according to its own truth. And that is why this is the age of peace according to Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah is predicting that this civilization is going to be age of peace. It's the age of peace ultimately not because of political reasons and institutions, which are important as well, but ultimately because of this harmony between inner truth of the human beings, which is the realm of spirit, attributes of God, and the harmony of this with the external reality, a world, a civilization, a society, institutions, relations, economy, politics, culture, which is based upon those same spiritual principles of unity, nonviolence, and the like. Anyway, forgive me if I allowed myself to be too, free in reflection, speculation, and so on, but this, I have never done this, what I did right now here. But this is one example of how some of the texts that we are familiar with might be looked at them as having really composed of varieties of sophisticated layers and layers of reality, and of course through consultation of humanity, which all are capable, according to Aqdas, of recognizing, of understanding, all, Through consultation of this community with each other, we should share with each other, learn from each other, and correct our mistakes, and revise our understanding and better our understanding and so on, with regard to the world, with regard to spiritual texts and so on. So I finish at this time, but you can see that Kitab Aqdas is not just an ordinary book of religious rituals and laws. It is based upon primarily a mystical discourse about the truth and reality of human beings and society and the creative nature of this spirit. If there are comments or questions, please share. Yes?
Hey, what's cool, thanks. Wow, Mike. What's the think creation, a subject you were talking about? Like thinking, and you think and you. Does the Baha'i faith believe that you think you create, your thoughts create the world around you, or is it like it's just like a place to live, basically?
Well, that's a very important philosophical question. And in philosophy, there are different schools of thought. Some believe that reality is nothing but a set of ideas and experiences. There is no reality independent from that. Some argue that mind is just, like a mirror, just a reflection of the reality. The only thing which exists is the reality out there. But regardless of these disputes among philosophers and so on, there is one fact which is beyond dispute in terms of these questions, which normally in philosophy there is not much paid attention to this. I pay attention to this more because I come from my particular area, which is sociology. In social theory, what we discover is that the realm of society, the realm of civilization, this realm is not something natural which is out there. This is created by human beings. There would be no language if there were no human beings. There would be no economic system, whether call it capitalism, communism, feudal order, whatever we want to call it, without human beings, activities of human beings, ideas of human beings, interaction of human beings. There would be no political institution, call it democracy, dictatorship, despotism, whatever, without activities, interpretations, ideas, interactions of human beings. In other words, to make it very simple and general, there is a realm of culture, and then there is a realm of nature. The realm of nature is not created by human beings, nor by our ideas, although now increasingly our ideas are affecting that realm of nature and to a large extent destroying that realm of nature. But in principle, the realm of nature has some fundamental primacy and independence from human beings. But the realm of culture is different. The realm of culture is a symbolic realm. Everything is symbolic. And this realm of culture does not exist without human beings. It's product of the activities of human beings. It's product of the activities of mind. It is expression and objectification of mind. All our social institutions, all our political institutions, our language, our economy, look at the realm of nature. Animals have food, right? But what is their food? They go and find something here. At the most, they go and hunt. The human beings are different. We create our food. We go and engage in agriculture, for example. Through activities of a spirit, as a spiritual entity, we create food. And then, we are not content with that. Animals, they have the food, they eat it. We have to cook it. Cooking is a primarily human phenomenon. It's an absolutely cultural, spiritual principle, cooking. Namely, we create something but then we have to cook it and turn it into dishes and so on, and then to bring a lot of artistic ideas and principles and so on, and then create cultural principles of what kind of food I should have. This culture has this food, this taste, this culture doesn't have, and relations of this. Everything that we do in our lives is product of culture. Look at what you have eaten. Look at the clothes that you have. Clothes. What is clothes? Clothes is all culture. It's our activities, our ideas. And the food that we have has nothing to do with nature. This food is coming from Mexico. That food is coming, I don't know, from, although in California it is hard to say that. It used to be in Minnesota, and it was easy to talk like that. Because in Minnesota, particularly these long winters, there is no food whatsoever. So everything that people have is created somewhere else and brought through transportations, human activities, and so on. So the realm of society, the realm of culture, is product of human activities and so on. However, the form of culture, society, civilization that Kitab Aqdas is talking about is a different culture. Not only is product of the activities of mind, of a spirit, it is product of the truth of this spirit and recognition of all as spirits and as spirituals and so on. And that's the meaning of really the realization of kingdom of God on earth. Earth becomes a reflection of the spirit. That's why it becomes kingdom of God on earth. Yes?
I guess I got a little stuck on what you talked about regarding Descartes' theory, that you said the idea of God becomes existence of God. So can you elaborate a little bit on the logic behind this, and if there are people who are saying the exact opposite, like what goes against this theory?
Well, anything in philosophical speculation is subject to discussions and so on. But this is usually called, in a more simplistic expression of that, the ontological proof for the existence of God. And the basic idea that a philosopher, a Christian philosopher, medieval philosopher, his name is Anselm, he is one of the first who discussed that. In Islamic philosophy, there is a lot of similar discussions, but in totally different terminology. That in God, essence and existence become identical. Namely, in different things, in ordinary things, they are contingent beings. Contingent means that existence and essence are different. Because their existence and essence are different, they may be, they may not be. But something that we imagine, it might be, it might have existence today, but tomorrow it might not have. So existence and essence are not necessarily one and the same. And in that philosophy, the idea is that so everything is contingent. It may be, it may not be. God becomes different. God becomes that essence, that definition, that principle which requires existence. And existence and essence becomes absolutely one and the same. And therefore God becomes not a contingent entity, but becomes a necessary entity, that its existence is necessary, and then it becomes a source of causation of everything else. Every contingent being, for existence to be joined to the essence, it is necessary the activity and the revelation of that God. So in Islamic philosophy also, in some ways, and there is the same thing in Christian philosophy, Jewish philosophy, all of them have this idea. Also is present in a way. But the way Descartes mentions it, philosophically, is the most interesting. He says, let's define God. And he says, this is the definition of God. God is that reality, by definition, which has all the perfections absolutely. And now the question is whether it exists or not. And then he adds, but existence itself is perfection. Non-existence is a deficiency, non-perfection. So he says, existence, however, is a perfection. Therefore, God, by definition, must have existence as its definition. Namely, by definition, God's definition requires existence. And existence and idea, the principle, and the objectivity of that become one and the same. So, in this form of analysis, but our objections against it, lots of them. Kantian philosophy was one of the main ones. I believe Kant was incorrect in his criticism of this. However, there are lots of people who are opposed to it and so on. But in some ways, the conception of God, the idea of God, becomes this absolute reality in which subjectivity and objectivity, thought and reality, essence and existence becomes absolutely one and the same. It's the absolute spirit, consciousness, but it is the absolute existence and reality and objectivity and being. And so this is the precondition for the possibility of any truth, because the truth became the question of correspondence or unity of the two realms with each other. But God becomes, by definition, becomes the absolute unity of the two. It becomes the absolute truth. And the firstness of Kitab al-Aqdas partly is emphasizing this, namely the recognition of this fundamental truth of God and the revelation of God. That becomes the first truth which makes possible the existence of any other truth. Yes?
When you're talking about the truth, you have two kinds of truth. One is absolute, the other one is relative, isn't it?
Well, truth is, by definition, truth is different from the real. The real is what is there. Truth is an idea. I have a notion of you. I have a picture of you. I have an experience of you. Now, this experience, this idea can be false or true. If it corresponds with you, if it is similar to you as your reality, then my idea, my experience is true. If it doesn't correspond to your reality, then it is false. So truth becomes opposed to falseness. Truth is very different from the question of reality. Reality is out there, whether anybody knows it or not. But question of truth makes sense only when there is a consciousness, when there is an idea, when there is experience. And then the question is whether this idea, this thought, is the same as, corresponds with, reflects correctly that reality or not. And here, although it appears that it is so easy, it becomes the most difficult philosophical question. Because how do you know that your idea corresponds to the reality? There is no easy answer to this question. In the very simplistic example that I told you, you have a picture of this wall in your mind. And you don't know if this is true or not. You might have made mistake. But what do you do in order to test whether this is true or not? You come closer. You go here and look at this. And then you see that it corresponds to what you saw before. But in reality, Hegel noted this. This is a discussion by Hegel. Hegel says, but what you are doing, you are comparing one experience with another experience. One idea with another idea. You didn't get out of experience, get out of thinking. So you have no touch with the reality as reality yet. That's why a new theory of truth emerged. They call it coherence theory of truth. And the idea is that our ideas about the world is true if this idea is coherent with other ideas that we have. If they all seem to be harmonious and so on, then we call it truth, because there is no way that we can compare it to the reality out there. And for this a purely materialistic theory, as philosophically, is very simplistic notion, because even the existence of something outside of mind is questionable. Even the idea that you guys are real, outside of my thinking of you are real and sitting there, philosophically it's very difficult to prove this, because I have only the experience. I can't compare this experience with another. I can come and touch you and shake hand, and I have some feelings. But these are all, again, another set of experiences. Comparing experiences with experiences. How do I know that as an objective reality, you are there out there? These are the philosophical questions. And for that reason, philosophically, idealism, the idea that the primary reality is thought, is spiritual, is much easier to accept than a pure, simplistic, mechanistic materialism. All reality is matter. That is a very simplistic philosophical thesis. If you want to go immediately with question of knowledge and truth, you are safer to be an idealist and a spiritualist rather than a materialist. But in any case, the idea of God in varieties of philosophical systems, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, becomes this guarantee that creates this guarantee, psychological guarantee for you, that, okay, the ideas that I have of the world, this cannot be just deception. This cannot be just lies, because there is God and He's good, or she is good, or it is good, that God, because it's all of these are linguistic meaningless terms. But aside from this, the question of truth becomes something different when this object that I want to know is myself, or product of my own mind, or expression of my own mind. And this is when the realm of culture, civilization, society, products of activities of spirit become relevant. Not the realm of nature, but human world, a world of spirit. And in that realm, there is, in a sense, a privileged possibility of truth as compared to others. Anyway, I know that, these are a bit strange discussions. For some of you might love this and relate to this and so on. But I thought that among different discussions that we have, it is good also once to take, this set of categories and roles and interests and so on, and look at Baha'u'llah's text from this point of view. I always loved philosophy, and so a lot of my thoughts and my approaches to writings in the Baha'i faith are influenced by that philosophical interest and so on. So I'm glad I shared it, and I'm glad that there is no collective revolt against it.